Okay, so welcome to this talk on Volution theory, the fifth of the Merry Musings in the Merry Musings series. This is really, I guess, what lies at the foundation of a lot of my latest thinking. It was what came out of my PhD research at Ubiquity University in our Wisdom School. So I'm just going to walk through the different elements of Volution theory, some reflections on it, and take my time today so that hopefully you can get a feel for it and the different elements of it, and then we can dive into more aspects of it afterwards. So I like this quote somebody shared with me from Tesla, saying, "The day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in 1 decade than in all of the previous centuries of its existence." So, and in a way, Volution theory came out of my questions around, well, what is all of this stuff that I see and experience going on in the non-physical domains? And how do we make sense of it? How do we tell a story about it that creates space for it? Because at the moment, our kind of stories about evolution and life and the scientific perspective tend to exclude these phenomena. And so that was why I was looking for something that wouldn't exclude the scientific or evolutionary perspective, but would transcend it, but also include the core elements of it, but expand it to be able to include these other dimensions of reality that obviously the ancient wisdom traditions have always seen, and that modern science is actually coming to discover itself. So part of, what led to my quest into Volution was my sense that the linear way of thinking that we had about life and development was insufficient to explain what's actually going on. And part of that came from my working with developmental psychology models, and particularly with spiral dynamics, and looking at those earlier phases, particularly the pre-rational, pre-cognitive phases, and knowing that when the civilizations emerged there, they actually came up with technologies that we're now just discovering that seem to be able to do things that our current scientific approaches can't even do. So how come that there was a lot of wisdom back then, but there were also certain technologies evolving that reflect a higher level of complexity than one would expect if one purely followed the developmental psychology models, which have a general directionality of increasing complexity, as they state. And I realized then that as I was exploring that the very concept of linear time is actually a relatively recent phenomena, which kind of surprised me because we tend to take it as granted and to see it as like one of the key non-questionable aspects of the universe. And yet, before we developed the rational cognition in the pre-cognitive phases of development, 3 million years as hunter-gatherers, we didn't experience reality as linear. We experienced it primarily as cyclical. And in fact, the linear only emerged at a later stage and came hand in hand with agriculture, where we, for the first time, started to sow things to be able to reap them in the future. So we postponed our moment of gratification until later on, and emerged at the same time as the alphabet, as linear rational thought, all of those things. So there was a critical moment in our evolution that we seem to have has provided the foundation for where we've gone on to as Western civilization. but somehow failed to re-embrace. So those past earlier phases, it's like we'd forgotten them, that we buried them somewhere. And what Volution theory is an attempt to do is to reintegrate those and say, well, what happens if we have this linear perspective, but what happens if we embed it in this more cyclical nonlinear perspective, which it actually emerged out of? Core elements of the perspective that emerged along with linear time was this idea of kind of us at the center moving through time and space. So we move along a pathway, a linear pathway of development. We move through a world of separate things around us. We can interact with them as objects. But my sense of it was, and this is something just to feel into and that we can, we'll work through as we go through the talk. What if instead of us moving through time and space, we're actually still and time and space is moving through us? That's just a perspective to contemplate that seems to actually be the conclusion of Volution theory if you follow it through. Another thing that got me thinking about this and questioning the kind of linear path that we all take for granted was that if you look at, this is just a question of sizes and scales of things. If you look at the human and the size of the human being, and you look at what's the biggest thing we've discovered and what's the smallest thing we've discovered, you find that, funnily enough, we're almost exactly halfway. So Laszlo and Caravan say we human beings literally stand midway on the scale between the nuclear and the galactic realm. So is that just chance? Or does that say something about the nature of how we develop and expand our awareness of things? That it doesn't just go one direction, but it seems to go two directions at the same time, like the tree sending its branches up into the sky and sending its roots down into the earth at the same time. So as our understanding of the universe gets bigger, we understand more of the universe. At the same time, we understand smaller and smaller details of it. So that was another thing that was kind of provoking my curiosity to explore if there was a way of understanding our reality that was less linear than the story that we currently tell. On the time side of things, I was starting to see that what seems to go on is that any moment that we want to individually or collectively take a step into a future or to a new level or phase of development, we're nearly always presented with like a bill from the past that we have to pay to be able to take that step forward. That somehow our movement into the future is tied to an experience in the past. And that as we want to send those branches higher, we have to send the roots deeper, and we bump into stuff that we have to work through and turn into nourishment, that an energy that enables us to take that step into the future. So there seemed to be a relationship between past and future. It wasn't just we move from one to the other, but actually in that journey that we're moving not just into the future, but we're moving into the future and into the past at the same time. This is another way of looking at it. This comes from the eco-intention work. Just going to have to try admitting Jan Jung again here. So yeah, this is another perspective on this question of linear versus cyclical time. The idea that the things that have happened in the past, so the red kind of arrow going down, cycles around and starts to come into our reality through the emerging future. And anything that we don't deal with from the past will show up again for us in the future. And that's the, you know, the same image really as the tree and the roots. The deep interconnectedness, you know, when you look at how a seed grows and expands, it doesn't just send its kind of shoots upwards. It sends its shoots upwards and its roots downwards at the same time. So we don't just grow in one direction. We grow in both of these directions at the same time. So how do we make sense of that as part of the evolutionary inquiry? And this is what I mentioned earlier about a, you know, inconsistency in a way in our linear models that seem to say we become ever more evolved and civilized and have greater access to greater complexity the further we go down the timeline. And yet there were these ancient civilizations with great wisdom and technology that we're really only just coming to appreciate and understand. So how does that play out? Now, the model that I was used to working with was this developmental model called spiral dynamics that basically describes how value systems emerge in us as individuals and collectives over time. And the experience that made me question the linearity of this was work that I did with a dancer and composer, choreographer, Dylan Newcomb, who now has this organization called Uzazu that he works with people in how to work with energy dynamics in your body, where he had a sense that some of the dynamics he was starting to discover with his dancers somehow reflected this developmental model. But the interesting thing that he discovered, and he was working with, he came to see afterwards how these energy dynamics were reflected in the I Ching, that these, the white and the black, are the reflection of the yin and the yang. That when the dancers went through the first 4 stages, they kind of went from step to step, and each one felt qualitatively different. But from the midpoint, so when it went from blue into orange, it seemed to mirror. So you'll see that the circles, let's say at the 5th level, are like a mirror of the circles in the 4th level. So it didn't just go to a next stage, but there seemed to be another dynamic going on. And likewise, the green mirrored the red, and the yellow mirrored the purple, and the turquoise mirrored the beige. Now, traditionally in this model, you move from stage to stage. It's like one stage transcends and includes the next one. So it builds, they build on each other. And there hadn't really been any reflection on how these different value systems related to each other. And here we were with dancers who had no idea of the model at all, but were just listening to their body in terms of the dynamics. Here we were discovering that it didn't seem to be as linear as we thought. There seemed to be a connection between the 2 at the center, and then the next 2 out, and the next 2 out, and the next 2 out. And so when I started to think about that, this was another thing that we discovered, was that the chakras seem to function as transition energies between the different stages. So when you move from one stage to another, it was kind of activated through one of the chakras. And the interesting thing is, of course, that the central chakra, the love chakra, sits at the center. And you notice what the symbol is of it here is 2 interlocking triangles. So in a way, like the the top part and the bottom, the top four and the bottom four interlocking with each other, you have this chakra at the center here. So that set me thinking about the nature of our developmental models, the way we think about them, and what are these relationships that are starting to show up here that we hadn't up till now thought about. So here you can see, you know, how they're mapped out between the different value systems. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the top one and the bottom one, for example, the beige and the turquoise value systems, they are essentially both about unity. But the beige one is a precognitive experience of unity, and the turquoise one is a postcognitive or transcognitive experience of unity. So they both have unity as a common theme. And you begin to see that there are themes that seem to be connecting these different value systems. And in fact, the general theme seems to be from unity at the extremes, you move in and things become increasingly refined as you move into the center. So as you get into the blue and orange value systems, that's really the kind of nitty-gritty of the society, of the rules, the way things are organized, of the scientific exploration into all the parts. Whereas when you're out at the beige and the turquoise, you're focused on the whole. So in the little table you can see at the top, I framed it in the purple. So I talked about the beige and the turquoise as being the unity. The purple and yellow are both have a shared quality of connection. So, but purple is like a precognitive experience of interconnectedness and is focused on the tribal in-group connectedness, whereas yellow is in a kind of desperate quest to connect up all the different pieces that need to be connected up globally to solve our global challenges. When you look at red and green, the red stage is the first stage that the sense of separate self emerges that I was referring to earlier. It's about me and my identity. Well, the green, which maps to it, is also about identity, but it's very much about we as a whole. When you look at blue and orange, the focus is on manifestation, like getting things down, making things happen, the material world outside and around us. And blue is focused on order, structure, getting the systems in place, and orange is about playing the game and within those systems and structures, growing like any organism would do. Now, you see also those words internal and external. So when we explored this with the dancers, we discovered that the focus of the bottom two and the top two, so beige and purple and yellow and turquoise, was as primary tone was it was internally focused. It was more of a yin system. It was focused on the connectedness, the relationship between things. Whereas the central four systems are focused on external, so on the world around us and on all the parts outside of ourselves. And what is actually where the place that we're at as humanity at the moment is, in a way, we've pushed the external to its extreme in sense of a focus on all the things around us, trying to make more and more, grow more and more, divide things up into smaller and smaller pieces. And we're at that edge now where we need to reconnect to the internal, the sense of interconnectedness, interrelatedness. I mean, if you ask people, what's the core of our problem today? They nearly always come back to something like, it's the relationship to ourselves, to each other, and to the earth. But it's all about having lost that sense of connectedness or that sense of relatedness. So what I was starting to see was how you've got this kind of meta pattern of going from an internal into an external. And that actually, this isn't just a linear process from beige up to turquoise, although that is a perspective and a level of experience. But actually, you've got like a tension, a polarity between, let's say, the top and the bottom, where you could see the beige as being like the seed, or the first early possibility. And then you've got turquoise as being the potential, what it could become. And the octave as the completion. You know, if you're playing an octave on the piano, you play the 8th note, and bing, it seems to complete the whole thing. And there's actually what's going on is like almost a breathing process from the extremes here, so beige and turquoise, into the manifest details at the center in the external, and that the system is continually breathing in and out, connecting information and from the informational worlds, let's say, at the more internal, into the manifest worlds at the more external. So this was, you know, the thesis that was starting to form as I looked to develop the Volution theory. And it was helped very much by some geometry that was shared with me, and particularly this form, the torus. Because here I saw a form of something that seemed to be held in a polarity, and yet that polarity was creating a dynamic, a flow between, let's say, the extremes and the center. And at the center of a torus is actually where you have the black hole. But that center skin, as it comes in, and they almost touch there, but they don't quite, is the same as the outer skin, right? So you can see that central skin comes in, and then it goes around, and it's the outer skin, and it comes back in again. That there was something about that dynamic that was related to this kind of inquiry that I was engaged in. As I go into a bit more detail on what is really, I guess, Volution, a description of the manifestation process. So how life manifests, evolves, how things come into being. It's important to note that it's not trying to describe the void or the oneness or the ultimate unity of everything, because you can't really put words to that, because words by their nature distinguish things from each other. So there's this lovely quote here: though words are spoken to explain the void as such can never be expressed. Though we say the mind is a bright light, it's beyond all words and symbols. Although the mind is void in essence, all things it embraces and contains. So in a way, this is a kind of footnote to say everything I'm going to talk about now, Volution and what it's meant to describe, is describing the process of manifestation. And at the same time, the void exists and there's not much we can say about it. So in a way, the next step down from the void is what's been called the unified field. So the place where everything is interconnected. Of course, in the void, there isn't anything, so it's meaningless to say everything is interconnected. But at the level of things starting to, like, the most unified of all the stuff, it's what we might call the unified field. And this image and some really good inspiration for my thesis came from a guy called Marshall Lefferts, who's put out a beautiful book called Cosmometry, and it's got a nice website on it as well. So here's a unified field, and the proposal is from kind of Buckminster Fuller and the folks into sacred geometry, is that there is a geometry to this unified field. And when you look at it like this, it's at this point, it's a very stable geometry. So you've got the lines connecting up to each other, and that's locked in. So nothing is happening at this point. It's just the unified field. There's nothing going on. Now this is when you look at a picture of the cosmos, you see the same toroidal form there. and this polarity between two extremes, but then that produce at a 90-degree plane the world of matter. So what Volution attempts to describe is in a way taking the thesis that the dynamic of a torus and moving from that unified field into movement is a better description of the way life works than the kind of ladder of life, unidirectional, evolutionary perspective that has been such an important part of our civilization so far. So these are just a series of simple graphics that attempt to describe thesis of how Volution works. And it starts with a seed, like at the bottom you can see there, this seed, and then but that seed at the same time has a field of potential that it could become, that are the small dots nodding around. So you've got seed and you've got potential. You could say it's present moment, possible future, if you want to put it in that kind of perspective. But it's a tension field between something that's a seed, if you think of it as really packed and dense matter, and the potential is the field into which it could grow. So the possibility of what it could become. Think of the acorn in a way, and the oak tree. So when the acorn is still an acorn seed, the field of potential for it to become an oak also exists. So they co-emerge at the moment there's a seed, the same moment there is a field of potential. And the process is essentially of those two growing into each other, one growing into the other. And if you think of this as 3D, so going back to that image of the Taurus galaxy, it's got around the torus is a skin, the outer layer. It's what we call the surface or the brain, like a membrane of an entity. So let's say we've got this acorn and this oak potential. Then there exists a field of information, which is everything that this seed could become, that is held on the brain, the surface, the membrane of this toroidal form. So there it is again, that image. You've got the seed, you've got the potential, and then you've got the surface brain, on which, and we'll come back to some of the science around this later, on that brain is where all the information is held. That is like, sometimes, when people ask me about the soul, it's like, in a way, it's like the soul, because it's everything that entity could become is held in that container. And we can't outgrow it, because it is us. It's our, it's like the fish in water. We can't see beyond that, because that's everything that contains the potential that we have to fulfill in this particular lifetime. So the potential and the seed, they grow into each other. And at the center there, you might recognize that is the heart chakra. And the interesting thing is that the heart is the first organ to emerge in the womb. And then from that, everything else grows out. So we don't start with the toes and then grow up until like the crown is completed. It starts from the heart and expands. That's how we grow. That's also how a seed grows. So on the one hand, you've got the potential growing into the seed, and that's emerging out from a center point. And expands and embraces, I find, as a more adequate term than transcend and include, because transcend and include, which Ken Wilber uses a lot, so that has quite a linear perspective to it. But really, if you're growing out from the center, it's more of an expand and embrace. And that reality. So when you've got the seems, you've got the torus, seems for some reason that I have heard people refer to various esoteric teachings about this, but seems to manifest at a 90-degree plane. So again, if you remember the image of the torus and the universe, that galaxy manifests at a 90-degree plane to the information fields. So when I tried to look at what is the core pattern here, and how is it being reflected in different wisdom traditions and things, I saw these three core elements to it. You've got the manifest reality, which is already where the information has already come into form. You've got the container, the membrane that holds all of the potential information. And then you've got the dynamics that go on between that container and the manifest. So how that information actually comes into form, that process. And that Trinity is what I saw as being reflected in a lot of the wisdom traditions, which I just got a few examples of here. So the container, for example, known as the Black Madonna, or the Absolute, the One, the unified field. As I mentioned before, I see the surface as the kind of soul. The manifest is the world of the many, the one and the many, or the Christ and Mary. And the dynamics are the spirit, Shekinah, the subtle energies. And if you, if you go to the thesis on the volutiontheory.net, there is a chapter called Trinity, and there's a big table there that lists out all sorts of different trinities from different traditions that are basically describing these three elements. So you could say the story that all of these traditions have told is really the story of life, which shouldn't be surprising, but it does show the pattern across all of these different traditions, where on the one hand, you've got the world of the manifest. The other hand, you've got the unified field, the container that has all the potential information on it. And then you've got what goes on in between. And Ken Wilber in his theories would talk about gross being the manifest, subtle the dynamics, and causal being the container. So another example of this Trinity. So what I realized is that here was a pattern that was essentially describing a manifestation process. Yeah, as I mentioned before, the black hole at the center of the torus connects to the unified field at the extreme. So because it goes in and loops around, it's both right at the center and it's right at the extreme. And there's the image again of the torus and the universe, the galaxy. So we've got the container. This is other language. This comes from the Weird, for those of you who saw the Weird talk, where he describes, this is the ancient kind of Western shamanic tradition in England and Northern Europe, where he talks about three main elements: the soul, the life force, and the shield skin. And the shield skin is, what wraps around you in the manifest world. And then you've got the life force of the dynamics, and then you've got the soul as the potential and container. So here's, hopefully you won't get the echo this time. Data from NASA's Fermi Gamma Ray Space, but this is how they discovered, NASA discovered a gigantic, mysterious structure in our galaxy. Discovered this structure that looks like the torus. Feature looks like a pair of bubbles extending above and below our galaxy's center. These enormous gamma-ray emitting lobes aren't immediately visible in the Fermi all-sky map. However, by processing the data, a group of scientists was able to bring these unexpected structures into sharp relief. Each lobe is 25,000 light-years tall, and the whole structure may be only a few million years old.
Within the bubbles, extremely energetic electrons are interacting with lower energy light to create gamma rays, but right now, no one knows the source of these electrons. Are the bubbles remnants of a massive burst of star formation? Leftovers from an eruption by the supermassive black hole at our galaxy's center? Or did these forces work in tandem to produce them? Scientists aren't sure yet.
Scientists aren't sure yet. So there's the pattern again, right? So when I saw this, I was, oh, look, you know, whether it's related or not, I haven't gone into the kind of proof and the evidence around it, but it's serious synchronicity that there you've got exactly the same pattern kind of manifesting out in the physical world, and that we haven't, our scientists anyway, haven't been able to explain it properly. There's another image of the kind of toroidal forms in the galaxy. You see the pattern once you've kind of spotted it, as it were, the pattern comes back again and again. So this is from Buckminster Fuller, and this is when I saw this presented, which Marshall Lefferts presented during his cosmometry talk at one of the Ubiquity events in Chartres. This is what they call the Jitterbug. Oops, let's go back. I want to play it again. And what the Jitterbug is a description of the dynamics of the geometry of manifestation. And what happens in the Jitterbug is that it cycles through, oh, I don't want to play you again. It cycles through actually the Platonic solids. So it goes through the 5 Platonic solids, which are accepted as being the core 5 geometries at the foundation of all matter, from the more subtle into the more gross and structured. And so what's going on inside of the torus as it breathes in and out from the internal kind of unified fields into the gross differentiated world, as it's breathing in and out and cycling through these different geometries that essentially take subtle information and turn it into gross matter. And then that gross matter resonates back up into the information fields. So this is a kind of geometric perspective on that dynamic. Now, the parts, and this is where when the geometry comes together, as this process is going on, what you see is that in the natural systems, the parts and the wholes relate in a certain way that is optimal for life. And that is where the whole phi and the Fibonacci sequence come in, that the relationships between the parts within a system have these sacred geometric proportions to them that naturally look beautiful to us, but that essentially are the most efficient way for life to combine parts into a bigger whole. Okay, so let's move on to this question of holographic, because there was the original book on the holographic universe, and as I was exploring the whole Volution question, this concept of the hologram kept coming back in a way as a fractal or as a pattern that was distributed throughout everything. And the thesis that kind of emerged as I was looking into it was that essentially on the skin of the torus, as I described, you've got all the information stored. And when light or consciousness is beamed through that skin, that membrane, that's what kind of transforms the information into energy and matter. And that is a holographic process. That's what I just want to spend a moment on now. Essentially, a hologram, you've got a unified beam of light coming through a laser. Think of that as in a way the void, the unity. There's no distinction or differentiation or anything. One unified beam of light. Then that splits it into 2. And then that passes through a sheet containing information about the nature of the form. And then that creates the 3D object, or the perspective of a 3D object. and that if you were to then cut that 3D photo into many, many parts, that holographic image, you wouldn't get just a part of the star, you'd get the whole star. So the pattern, when you look at a lot of the work that's been done on fractals, and this book on's called Scale, which looks at the maths that seems to cut across all sorts of things, from internet traffic to library book loans to growth of cities to earthquake size. You see the same patterns coming back again and again. So the holographic nature of the universe is something that's very much part of this perspective, the idea that you've got patterns at all levels. And so that needed to somehow fit the evolution theory. There needed to be a connection to it. And then I saw how, if you took the skin of the torus as being where the information is, so in a way that the glass plates, in a way what's between the glass plates, they're the holographic emulsion, and that light or consciousness was what passes through them, and that's what actually creates the 3D form in between, then that would explain, a lot of the holographic universe stuff. So here's another way of describing it. So a hologram's produced when a single laser light, so again, you've got unified consciousness, single laser light split into two separate beams into the relative world. First beam bounced off the object, second beam allowed to collide with the reflected light of the first. And the interference pattern is what's recorded on the film, and that gives you the 3D image. So yeah, what if the skin of the torus was a holographic plate through which universal light or consciousness passes, creating 3D form on a 90-degree plane? Now that takes a little bit of getting your head around, but that's the thesis, and it seems to make sense. And what you're seeing on the left is the interference of information waves on a holographic plate, what that looks like. So the process, let's say let's imagine that you've got the outside skin of the torus, the membrane that contains this information, and that light or consciousness is what activates it and brings it into form. That at the most extreme levels, let's say to the closest to the skin or the membrane, it's in archetypal form. And then as it comes, like from the spiral, remember we had like the beige and the turquoise in a way as the most archetypal. And then as it moved into the center with the blue and the orange, it becomes more refined. Well, if that's the process that's going on, then things become increasingly distinguished from each other as the information moves into form at the 90-degree plane at the center of the torus. So like in a way, like the yin yang, or the I Ching that goes from pure yin and yang and then into yin yang, yang yin, and then it kind of differentiates into more and more lines that give you increasing distinction and differentiation. That would be the kind of process that's going on. Yeah. So this connects to something called global scaling that I'm not going to go into in details now, but look it up afterwards if you want. But it describes a core pattern which seems to come back at all levels of reality, and it's created. So on the bottom right is kind of more details on the pattern of how it works. But you can see how it's created through a polarity, this time not at the top and the bottom, but at the left and the right. And that polarity is creating a certain wave dynamic. And think of, waves, energy is waves, and they carry information. So in a way, energy is information in movement. Okay, think of it like that. And energy shows up in waves. And those patterns of those waves come back like holographically at every different level of reality. And when you overlay two wave interference patterns, like in the top left, you get this global scaling pattern, which comes back at every part and every level dimension of reality. And that overlapping, those two overlapping circles, of course, are connected to a very powerful symbol of creation that has been in many of the wisdom traditions, known as the Vesica Pisces, when the one becomes the two. So when we move from the unified field into the relative world, and the first thing is the two, instantly the pattern is created that then comes back everywhere throughout the holographic torus, and therefore also in the material world that's manifest at that 90-degree plane. Yeah, if you relax your eyes when you're looking at this image, you notice that it starts to move, which is kind of freaky. But imagine that this is the holographic information field. And that in that field, there are ways, openings through which the light or the consciousness can pass through in order to be able to project the 3D form. Now, in many energetic traditions, people talk about these openings as often being blocked or polluted. So imagine that you've got this information field on the brain of the torus. Looks something like this, if we were to have to make it look like something. And light has to pass through that field to be able to generate 3D reality, and that those passageways for the light can be blocked or polluted. Now, if you were wanting to manifest something, be it health for somebody when they are unhealthy, or be it whatever it was, what would you do? You would unblock, because normally if everything was unblocked and flowing, there wouldn't be the illness, or there wouldn't be the stress or the blockages in the system, because you would be flowing from the unified field in a pure kind of self-organizing way along the lines of the principles of the universe, based on the sacred geometry and everything, into pure form where there wouldn't be the stress or the illness. So if that's not happening, it means that somewhere the light's not getting through. So that's why healers often talk about just unblocking, removing blockages so that the light or the consciousness and the energy can come in, or cleaning it up if it's polluted and distorting the light while it's coming through. So that's why, for example, in the eco-intention practice, which works with energy at large scale systems, one of the things you measure is blocked and stressed energy, so Dor and Oranor, to use the Willem Reich terms. And the way you can help a system to achieve its highest potential is by removing or transforming that blocked and stressed energy. So when I was looking at the pattern, and if we think of the spiral dynamics, the 8 levels that I showed you before, as being one surface manifestation of the underlying pattern of Volution. So what I was looking for was, how can I describe a pattern deeper, as it were, the pattern that connects? And this is in the anthroposophical tradition. You see on the left how they describe, and Steiner describes the way a plant grows. You see on the top picture, you've got the seed at the bottom starting to grow, but you've got its information field, or its aura, in a way, around the top, and those two are growing into each other. And there's that description. Earth forces are concentrated in the seed, then dissipated. Life throws matter up, opposite to gravity. Cosmic forces are brought down into the material world. And that's such a beautiful, simple description of the evolutionary process. And just look at that picture on the bottom. That is evolution in action, you know, at a plant level, but it happens at every level. Life throws matter up, branches go up into the sky, cosmic forces are brought down into the material world. So the first phase then that I named in this process is essentially you've got your seed. And within that seed, a lot of energy is built up and contained within the boundary of the seed. So it's not yet, no shoot has come out. It's not yet kind of popped its head up. It's still winter in a way. The energy is contained within the seed. So it's pure, it's only aware of itself. It's not even aware of anything else around it because there isn't, nothing else exists for it other than that level of reality. So at the next stage, the energy breaks through the boundary of the seed to start to expand, right? So you would get the roots going down, you'd get the shoots coming up. And in that first phase, there is no me and other. It's really just one. Isn't that interesting how me, other is so close to mother? Just notice that. In the second phase, the me and the other become differentiated. So you break out of your own boundary, as it were, and you notice self and other, the world around. Okay. And then what happens is that the energy continues to expand from its initial push. But at this point, isn't just expressing itself like in that second phase, but is actually able to look back and become conscious of itself and reflect upon itself and see itself. And then in the final phase, having seen itself, what it does is go back and attempt to heal and integrate itself to become whole again. So if you think about it being, it was whole as a seed, it wasn't anything else, it was just purely itself. And then it grows and becomes aware of itself and sees everything else around it, and then needs to reintegrate that whole experience to make itself whole again. So again, this is that journey from, remember, the internal, and then the two external phases, and then the internal again. So the first phase is internal, and then it goes external, and it goes external again, and then again it goes internal. And this is the pattern we can link. I think I might have a slide where we link this pattern to the spiral. But then what happens is that this fruit, so once it's gone through the stages, the seed has created its fruit. It's fulfilled its highest potential. Okay. And that fruit then becomes a seed for the next level. So yeah, here you can see those developmental levels mapped against it. So that beige purple, and in the childhood development, the baby isn't aware of itself being different to anything else. It's one with the mother in its experience. In the beige purple phases of our development, we are part of one whole system. It is just one. That's not a rational concept. It's an experiential concept. And then when red emerges, the sense of separate self comes through. So we break through our own cocoon, our own boundary, and become aware of ourselves and aware of the other, which of course creates all sorts of inner conflict, because there are comparisons and things that go on, and how you deal with the other, and blue is the response to try to create some order to that. But it's still not really thinking about itself. It's just trying to survive now that it's aware of all this whole world around it and make some sense and create some order in it. In the next phase, an important phase, is where it can actually then, now that it's created its structure, which means it can be in its entirety, there we are, the entity, it can then start to play with it a bit. So it can then, that's where the kind of self-awareness really starts to emerge in orange, and play the game. And then with green, it starts to become not just aware of the other, but sensitive to the other, and starts to realize that I am the other again, in an inkling. This is the kind of postmodern, as it tries to build relationship with other. Yellow then tries to integrate everything, and cognitively initially, and then when turquoise comes in, kind of intuitively feel itself as one and as the whole. So that's how these kind of four phases, in a way, are reflected in an example such as spiral dynamics. These just to show how these reflect other models that are out there. So, for example, Anne Baring's great work. She talks about the original participation and the lunar phase, and then the separation and the solar phase, and then the final participation or the integration phase. So it reflected, you know, as one would hope, other perspectives out there. Now, an important, as I kind of suggested just now, an important moment here is that midpoint. Remember, when we had the series of 8, we had the 7 chakras, and the heart center was right at the center at the midpoint. And it seemed to me that what goes on in the first half of the journey, as it were, is that we are following patterns that have been laid down for us in the past. So the path has already been cut, and we're just kind of, in a way, blindly following the path because, you know, it's been proven to work in the past, and we're just trying to stay alive and survive. So we're following the pattern in a way. And there are certain, you know, levels of life, you could say, that just follow that pattern. Now, the moment that a system awakens to itself, then, as I said at the top, you start to embark on your own mission into the unknown to fulfill your purpose. So you take a step into a new territory, not necessarily paths that have been laid down before. But as we do so, we have to reach back into a related piece of the past. That's what I was describing earlier on, to transform and release any limiting energy, or what in psychology is often called shadow. So it's one dynamic of light and shadow coming in. But from that midpoint on is where one starts to add to the existing field of information. So to co-create with life, not just to follow the paths and patterns, the morphogenetic fields that are talked about, that are already laid down, but actually to contribute to creating new cosmic grooves, as Ken Wilber might describe them. So just a little bit more on this process of integration that being related to growth. So essentially, the journey is one of, at one level, increasing freedom as we become more conscious of ourselves and are able to make more conscious and informed choices about the world around us. But in order to achieve that freedom, we have to do the integration work from the past. So we get this impulse to grow. And that may be because the world changes around us and we feel we need to, or maybe that we have excess energy over in ourselves and are ready to take the next step. So we stretch up. That in a way, we expand our consciousness. That brings in more light and awareness. And that light enlightens the shadow. So the greater the light, the clearer the shadow. So we stretch up for light, we see more shadow, we look to integrate that shadow, so that part of us that we somehow have been unconscious of, that we've split off somewhere, that holds within it the clue, in a way, for us to be able to take this next step towards freedom that we're after. And that then gives us the growth that we're looking for. So, yeah, so in a way, that with that threshold of self-awareness and the expansion of freedom being related to the expansion of integration, you could also say that the light is what, you know, expands, and the love is what connects. So it's through love, compassion, healing that we're able to actually do this, go on this journey of freedom and integration. And this again kind of reflects a lot, say, maybe the masculine and the feminine, the light and the love, mind and heart, etc. So, and that energy, that journey of integration then creates a cocoon, which becomes the seed for something completely new to emerge. So the seed has gone on a journey, and it's gone through this journey of self-discovery, of integration, and then fruition, becoming the fruit of the seed, achieving its highest potential. and then completion and locking in as a new seed for the next phase of a journey. And so I'm kind of suggesting that this is a pattern that can be seen at the individual level, but that can also be seen at collective level. So if we take the spiral dynamics model, for example, the proposition from this perspective is that once we reach turquoise, which is the 8th level, we're completing something. And that actually the way of thinking that that model describes is no longer adequate to describe what might come next, because something new will emerge from that seed once the completion has happened at turquoise that will have emergent properties way beyond the current phase of reality, as it were, and that we can't therefore use an old model to try to understand what that might be. Yeah, so it's going on at every level in Ken Wilber would call holarchies, wholes and parts. Everything is a whole in its own right and is also part of a bigger whole. So this pattern is happening everywhere at all levels. It's holographic. Oh yeah, this is the image I had on the earlier slide. Came from the Oregon Biodynamic Group, where you can see this story then described really beautifully in the natural world. And back to kind of wrap it around here, where you've got these phases of the spiral that reflect this journey and this concept of tensional integrity, where the tension between the seed and the potential is what holds, is what creates, is what pulls the unified field into action, into movement, into the toroidal flow. That is what ends up manifesting the form. Yeah, out with these different interconnected levels. Now, on the last Merry Musing, we went into some detail on the pain and the promise. So I'm not going to go into much detail here, but just to say for anyone who hasn't seen that, part of the Volution thesis, the part I call the pain and the promise, is that in our human journey, when we moved from the kind of pre-rational hunter-gatherer phase into becoming self-aware, so the awareness of the self emerged, we weren't able to transcend that previous experience of interconnectedness and reintegrate it or expand and re-embrace it, but we transcended and repressed it. So we cut off ourselves from our knowing that we are the earth, of our felt experience of being interconnected with everything else, which manifested also in a rejection of the feminine, of the body, to the burning of the witches and many other atrocities. And that has led to this kind of, in a way, crazy development that humanity has embarked on since that moment, where we've spent much time and money and resources killing each other and exploiting the planet and torturing other living beings on the planet, which, if you stop and think about it, is crazy. I mean, why would life create a life form to do that? It just doesn't make sense unless something happened somewhere that distorted that journey. And the wildness, in a way, the uncontrolled nature of that red system that emerged, that was really about everything for self-gain, kind of warlord style, led to an overly controlling blue system that has given us the kind of government and systems that we have today that justify their existence, and the police, the police systems and the armies that justify their existence to be able to try to control that explosion of red. So the imbalance that happened when the split occurred is what's led to, in my opinion, the kind of the behavior that we've managed to do to things we managed to do to each other and to the rest of life on this journey. Yeah, and then remember, we have the internal and the external that are shown here as well, that for us to be able to solve the problems that we're facing at the moment, we need to get access to this trans-rational sense of interconnectedness, which also gives us access to the subtle informational worlds, because we get beyond our rational mind that only looks at the parts and are able to re-engage our intuitive mind that's able to feel the whole. And that it's from that perspective that we'll be able to solve the challenges that we're facing at the moment. But to do that, we're going to have to heal the split that occurred between the pre-rational phases and the emergence of the rational phase. And that's a collective trauma, I believe, that we need to work on. But we also see it playing out in every individual's development and in family context. So people growing up in safe family environments where they're being looked after, where that phase is really given energy, that precognitive phase is really allowed to mature, and that people aren't kind of wrenched out of it and wrenched into a world of separation too early, because doing that means you've lost the container that can hold the emergence of the self. Otherwise, the self is unrooted, disconnected, and can wreak havoc on the world around it, as unfortunately we have seen. So this bit that emerged out of conversations that I had with Nishad, and that I was on our YouTube channel as well, where we have six sessions actually going into this. So what would this actually look like, you know, if you take it into these concepts, if we were to deal with this? And so with the evolutionary perspective, gives us in a way the framework within which this work. You can see why this would work at a bigger pattern, let's say at a bigger level. So in our current world, time is linear. You've got past, present, future. Thought is abstract. You've got the connected into the past and the future. We spend most of our time thinking about the past and the future. We have language that's really labeling things, so it's an abstraction from the actual thing. It differentiates things from each other. And we have a space around us where we see things as separate and most of matter as being innate and dead, essentially. Now, before we took this step, we experienced time as cyclical, non-linear. Our thought was direct and instinctual. Our language was concrete about the things around us and connected us to things. And we experienced space as being alive and interconnected. So what would happen if we were able to integrate the two of these? And this is just a sense of it, right, that Nishad and I have also kind of come to as we've been trying to feel what that might look like. So in the time, you're always present, and at the same time, you're aware of influence of the past and what's coming in from the future, but you don't lose yourself in them. So you're always very in the present, but also aware of those dynamics from past and the possibilities unfolding from the future. Thought follows intuition. So what comes first is the knowing from the unified field. And then thought is useful to implement the insights that we've gained. Language is not abstract, but connects you to people and things. It's full of meaning. It's not just meaningless. And we experience space as being, on the one hand, everything being interconnected, but at the same time, we also see everything being differentiated. So we can see the uniqueness of everything, and at the same time, we know that it's all interconnected. So just to finish with this Blake quote that ties us back to the beginning in a way. In the universe, there are things that are known and things that are unknown. And in between, there are doors. Things that are known and things that are unknown. And in between, there are doors. And feels to me that that's really what the evolution process is describing, are those doors between the known and the unknown. How does that process work? What are those doors that open? You know, as I'm proposing, they're related very much to the geometry, to the dynamics of the torus, to the polarity of things, and to this trinity that has shown up in so many traditions, ultimately as a description of how the known and the unknown come into relationship with each other and dance together. Bing. And yeah, so the whole dissertation PhD theory is online at volutiontheory.net. So feel free to explore that. There are some updates as well on a blog there, and on my own website. I also post events and more reflections building on the Volution theory. And then the most recent book is Leading from the Field, that describes 12 principles for a leader if they were to assume this perspective. So if you were to assume that this was the nature of reality, how would you go about leading your organization, being a leader in your community, or even leading your own life? So that's what Leading from the Field is about. Thank you for joining, and feel free to get in touch if you'd like to follow up on any of this.